Montana Territory, November 1881. Some folks say winter reveals who you truly are. I say it reveals who you're willing to become. Eleanor Sullivan was building her cabin one log at a time. 3 months from bearing a child, 6 months from the man who abandoned her. Blood from her scraped palm dotted the fresh snow like punctuation marks on a sentence she hadn't finished writing. She didn't know the cowboy watching from the aspens was a widower longing for the family he'd buried 5 winters back. Snow fell steady that afternoon, coating the half-built walls in white silence. She hammered another nail, breath steaming, belly heavy. He sat his horse at the tree line, hat pulled low, hands resting on the saddle horn. Neither moved for a long moment, just a woman building and a man watching, and winter settling in between them like a promise or a threat. By the time the blizzard came, and it would come, they'd have to choose. Freeze alone with your pride, or risk everything to build something that might not survive the spring. This is a story about what happens when broken people decide to mend each other, and what it costs when winter has other plans. Late afternoon, first snow of the season. Eleanor Sullivan drove the last nail before sunset, her father's hammer steady in her grip despite the cold that had turned her fingers the color of old leather. The cabin wasn't finished, not by half, but the child growing heavy in her belly didn't care about her schedule. Neither did Winter. She set down the hammer and pressed both hands to her lower back, arching against the ache that had become her constant companion. 7 months along now, and every log felt twice as heavy as the one before it. The tent she'd been sleeping in sagged under yesterday's snow. 2 more weeks and the roof needed to be on, or she'd be in real trouble. "Miss, I thought this place was abandoned." The voice came from the tree line, low and calm, with the faint drawl of a man who'd spent years with horses in silence. Eleanor straightened slowly, one hand instinctively moving to rest on her belly. She turned to find a man on horseback watching her from just beyond the clearing, his bay gelding pawing at the frosted ground. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She hadn't seen another soul in over a week, not since the Kowalskis brought flour and a warning about early snow. "This land is mine," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "If you're lost, head back west. There's nothing for you here." The man tipped his hat, afternoon light catching the weathered lines around his eyes. "I mean no trouble, ma'am. Name's Clayton Hartwell. Circle H, 10 miles north." He paused, his gaze flicking from the half-built cabin to the worn gloves on her hands, then, briefly, respectfully, to her belly. "Didn't expect to find someone building alone." Eleanor's grip tightened on the hammer handle. "I prefer it that way." Clayton dismounted with practiced ease, leading his horse a few steps closer, but keeping a respectful distance. His boots crunched lightly over frozen grass. "No offense meant, ma'am. Just most women don't do this kind of work." His eyes settled on her midsection again. "Especially not in your condition." "I didn't come here to fit most women," Eleanor said, lifting the hammer and striking a nail with sure, even force. "I came here to start over." Clayton watched her for a moment longer, then stepped back, raising both hands slightly as if to show he held no threat. "Fair enough. Just thought you might need help with something heavy. Carrying a child and a cabin at the same time, that takes grit." "I've got grit." Eleanor positioned another plank. "What I don't have is time for charity. So if you're offering pity, take it back to Circle H." Something shifted in Clayton's expression. Not offense, but understanding. He studied the cabin frame, the square corners, the clean joinery. "Good work, better than good." "Not pity," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Just respect. Takes grit to build something from nothing. Takes more to do it when the world's against you." He paused. "I see you. That's all." Eleanor stopped hammering. She turned, really looking at him for the first time. The man had the bearing of someone raised with comfort, but there were lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of loss. His clothes were clean, but his hands were calloused. And there was something in his expression, a flicker of something she hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding. "I appreciate that, Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice softer now. Clayton nodded once, then mounted his horse again. Before turning back toward the aspens, he hesitated. "Storm's coming tonight, ma'am. I can smell it on the wind. Make sure your fire's banked good." Eleanor didn't answer. She watched as he rode off, disappearing between the trees. Only when he was gone did she lean against the half-built wall and exhale, one hand pressed to where the child moved beneath her ribs. "That's not the kind of man who passes through by accident," she murmured to herself. And though she wouldn't admit it aloud, her heart had stirred too, not with fear, but with something that frightened her more: hope. 3 days later, the morning sun hung low, casting long shadows across the frozen prairie. Eleanor stood at the base of her half-finished cabin, a plank of rough-hewn pine balanced awkwardly against her shoulder. Her lower back throbbed with every breath, her fingers stiff from cold and labor. The baby had shifted lower in the past week, bringing with it a new heaviness that made each task feel like climbing a mountain. Still, she worked. She had to. She'd driven the foundation stakes herself, hauled each log from the woods with only a borrowed cart and determination. Her food stores were packed tight in the root cellar, and her chimney now pulled cleanly with smoke. But the walls weren't done, and the snow whispered of harder days coming. She set the plank down with a grunt, breath catching as a sharp ache lanced across her side. "You're pushing too hard." The voice, deep, familiar, startled her. She spun, heart leaping, to find Clayton Hartwell standing beside his bay gelding at the edge of the clearing. He held a bundle in his arms, wrapped in checkered cloth. He looked less formal today. No vest, no gloves, just a wool coat and eyes that saw too much. Eleanor tightened her grip on the hammer. "I didn't ask for company." "No," he said gently, "but I figured I'd come anyway." He took a slow step forward and placed the bundle atop a stump. "My mother sent this, tea for nausea and some baby clothes she knitted. Said you'd probably pretend not to need them, but send them anyway." Eleanor stared at the bundle, not moving. Her throat tightened. Clayton glanced at her cabin walls. "Coming along? You've done all this yourself?" She gave a curt nod. "Every nail." "Impressive." He looked at her belly, then at her hands. Red, scraped, swollen at the knuckles. "Painful too, I imagine." Eleanor folded her arms across her chest, bracing herself against the cold and something warmer she didn't want to feel. "Why are you really here, Mr. Hartwell? Slumming, or just gathering stories to tell your mother?" Clayton's gaze didn't flinch. "I came because I wanted to, and because I don't like the thought of you working through pain alone when it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not a charity case. I never said you were." She stepped forward, voice tight. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. Men like you offer help like it's some kind of blessing, but it always comes with a price. Expectations, judgments." He didn't speak at first, just let her words hang there in the morning frost. Then softly, "Some people offer help not because they think you're weak, but because they admire your strength." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. Clayton continued, quieter now. "I've seen a lot of people fold under less than what you're carrying. But here you are, building something real, alone, with no one watching, no one clapping. That's not weakness. That's rare." She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "I won't stay," he added, gesturing to the bundle. "Just thought you could use the tea. And maybe a reminder that not everyone who shows up is looking to fix or claim you." Eleanor looked at the bundle, then at him. The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than any flirtation could have. He meant it. "You can leave it there," she said finally. He nodded once, turned, and walked back toward his horse. She watched him go, her pulse louder than the wind. When he vanished into the trees, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She moved to the stump and opened the cloth. Inside were 3 tiny knit garments, soft yellow wool stitched with care, and a tin of tea leaves that smelled faintly of ginger and mint. For the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, something in her chest cracked. Not enough to fall apart, just enough to feel. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of day that made everything look clean even when it wasn't. Eleanor almost didn't go to church. She'd felt the distance growing all week. Conversations that stopped when she entered the general store, eyes that slid away from hers, the clerk's smile that never reached past his teeth. But she needed community, even if community didn't want her. and she refused to hide. She wore her best dress, though it was shabby now, and the fabric strained across her belly. Her father's locket hung visible at her throat. She walked the 8 miles to Willowbrook with her head high and her heart bracing for impact. The service passed in a blur of hymns and scripture she couldn't focus on. Afterward, she filed out with the congregation, keeping to herself. She saw Clayton across the churchyard. He nodded. She looked away, still bruised from learning about his engagement. Then Victoria Morrison appeared. She came with 3 other women, all dressed in imported fabrics that whispered money with every step. The approach was deliberate, public, designed for an audience. Miss Sullivan, Victoria's voice carried across the church steps. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Victoria Morrison, Clayton's fiancée. Eleanor's spine straightened. Miss Morrison, I understand you've been receiving assistance from my fiancé. Mr. Hartwell has been kind enough to help with some heavy labor, Eleanor said carefully. As a neighbor. Victoria's smile was sugar over glass. How generous of him. Though I must say, it does create an awkward appearance, a single woman in your condition accepting prolonged visits from an engaged man. The crowd had stopped pretending not to listen. Conversations died. Heads turned. Eleanor kept her voice steady. Mr. Hartwell has behaved with nothing but honor and respect. If you see scandal, that's your conscience, not mine. Victoria dropped the pretense, her voice sharpening to a blade. Let me be plain, Miss Sullivan. This arrangement needs to end. You're ruining a good man's reputation. His family's name is being dragged through every parlor in the territory. I never asked him to come, Eleanor replied. And I can't control what people choose to gossip about. But you can control whether you stay. Victoria stepped closer, voice dropping to something harder, meaner. This valley isn't kind to women like you, women who make mistakes and then burden decent men with the consequences. Eleanor's face flushed, not with shame, but with rage held barely in check. I haven't burdened anyone. I'm building my own home, on my own land, with my own hands. If Mr. Hartwell chooses to help, that's his decision, not yours. Miss Sullivan, that's enough, Victoria. Clayton's voice cut through the tension like an axe through kindling. He crossed the churchyard in long strides, coming to stand beside Eleanor, not touching her, but present, solid. Victoria's eyes flashed. Don't embarrass yourself further, Clayton. Everyone can see what's happening here. What's happening, Clayton said, his voice firm, is I'm helping a neighbor in need. Same as I'd help anyone. A neighbor? Victoria's laugh was sharp. Is that what we're calling her? You will speak to her with respect, Clayton said, and his voice dropped to something that carried warning in every syllable. She's done nothing wrong. Victoria played to the crowd now, raising her voice. Nothing wrong? She arrives in our town unmarried and expecting, builds a cabin on the edge of wilderness and lures. She hasn't lured anyone. Clayton cut her off, loud enough that people 3 yards away stopped mid-conversation. I offered help. She refused 3 times before accepting. That's pride, not manipulation. Murmurs rippled through the watching congregation, some sympathetic, some coldly judgmental. Victoria turned back to Eleanor, and when she spoke, her voice had gone to ice. You have until spring to leave. Sell the land. Go back east. Go anywhere. Just go. She paused, letting the threat settle. If you stay, I'll make certain every door in this valley closes to you. No credit at stores, no doctor for your delivery, no sanctuary here. Gasps scattered through the crowd. Eleanor stood trembling but fierce. This is my land, legally purchased. You can't force me off it. Perhaps not legally, Victoria said softly. But there are other ways to make a person unwelcome. She turned and swept away, her entourage following like a wake behind a ship. The crowd dispersed quickly, most avoiding Eleanor's eyes. A few nodded, small apologetic gestures that meant nothing against the weight of public judgment. Clayton stepped forward. Miss Sullivan, I'm sorry, I never meant for... Please go, Mr. Hartwell. Eleanor's voice was tight, controlled. Your fiancé is right. Your visits are causing problems. I don't care what she... I care. Eleanor looked at him then, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been fury. Go. She walked away, and this time she didn't look back. Clayton stood alone on the church steps, watching her retreating figure grow smaller against the white landscape, and felt something break loose in his chest that had been frozen for 5 long years. 1 week later, the wind had teeth. Eleanor worked through the afternoon, her movements slower now, heavier. The baby sat low and restless, pressing against her spine with every shift. She'd finished 3 walls and half the roof frame, working dawn to dusk despite the cold that turned her breath to fog and made the hammer slip in her numb fingers. Clayton hadn't returned. She told herself that was for the best, even as she caught herself listening for hoofbeats that never came. As dusk settled, she retreated to her tent and tried to start a fire. The kindling was damp. The flames sputtered and died. She tried again, her hands shaking from cold or exhaustion. She couldn't tell anymore. A sound outside froze her mid-strike. Footsteps, multiple. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached for the rifle she kept loaded by the tent flap, but before her fingers closed around it, a voice called out, "Miss Sullivan? It's Doc Harrison. I need to speak with you." Eleanor hesitated, then pushed through the tent opening. The town doctor stood at the edge of her clearing, his horse shifting nervously behind him. He was alone, but his eyes kept darting toward the darkening tree line. "What do you want?" Her voice came out harder than she intended. Doc Harrison raised both hands, showing he held no weapon. "I don't have much time. They're watching my practice." He pulled a leather envelope from inside his coat. "These are for you." "What are they?" "Papers. From a territorial judge in Helena." He stepped closer, his breath steaming. "Miss Sullivan, I've been a coward. I signed false medical certificates for men who paid me to look the other way. I kept silent when I should have spoken, but I won't be silent about this." Eleanor's hand trembled as she took the envelope. "I don't understand. Your husband, Charles Whitmore, he married another woman in St. Louis 8 months ago." Doc Harrison's voice was urgent, low. "Bigamy, which means your marriage was void the moment he took those vows. You've been free for half a year, Miss Sullivan. You just didn't know it." The world tilted. Eleanor gripped the envelope, her vision blurring. "How did you—" "I have friends in the telegraph office. When Victoria started making threats, I got curious, started digging." He glanced over his shoulder. "Those papers are signed and sealed. Legal? You're not bound to that man anymore." "Why are you helping me?" Doc Harrison's face softened with something that looked like shame. "Because I've looked the other way too many times. Let good people suffer while I protected my reputation and my fee." He backed toward his horse. "There's a frontier adoption law, territorial statute from '76. If you and Mr. Hartwell choose to form a family, witnesses can validate it without formal marriage. The church ladies know. Martha Kowalski knows. Clayton doesn't. He's engaged." "Not anymore." Doc Harrison mounted his horse. "He told his father yesterday, broke it off with Victoria this morning at the bank, nearly lost his inheritance over it." He gathered his reins. "He's probably riding this way right now." Before Eleanor could respond, the doctor spurred his horse and disappeared into the gathering dark. She stood alone in the snow, the envelope clutched against her chest, her mind spinning. Free. She was free. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Clayton emerged from the aspens, riding hard, his face set with determination. He pulled up 10 feet from her tent, dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. "Eleanor?" He never used her first name before. "I need to talk to you. Doc Harrison was just here." "I know. I saw him leaving." Clayton stepped closer. "I don't care what the town thinks. I don't care what my father threatens or what Victoria promises to destroy. I went home and told them both the engagement's off." Eleanor's breath caught. "Clayton, you can't throw your future away." "I'm not throwing anything away." He closed the distance between them until he stood close enough that she could see the resolve burning in his eyes. "I'm choosing what's real. You. This place. That child. I've seen more truth in the way you hold a hammer than I have in every ballroom conversation of my life." "There's something you don't know," Eleanor whispered. "Something I should have told you from the beginning." Then tell me now. She held up the envelope with shaking hands. I'm not divorced. I'm still married to Charles Whitmore. Legally? At least I thought I was. She opened the papers, her voice breaking. But he married someone else, which means I've been free this whole time and didn't know it. Clayton stared at her, then at the papers, then back at her face. And slowly, something that looked like wonder spread across his features. So you're saying there's nothing standing between us but fear? Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. He reached out and took her hands, rough, calloused hands that had built a home from nothing. Then let's choose something else, he said quietly. Let's choose this. The next 2 weeks passed like a dream Eleanor was afraid to wake from. Clayton came every morning, arriving with the sun and staying until the stars appeared. They worked side by side in companionable silence, the rhythm of hammer and saw becoming a language all its own. The cabin walls rose higher, the roof took shape, the chimney drew clean and strong. On the 8th day, they sat on the half-finished porch sharing coffee and cold biscuits. Snow fell gently, coating the clearing in fresh white. My wife's name was Sarah, Clayton said suddenly, his eyes on the distant mountains. We married young. Too young, maybe. She liked to race horses, said it made her feel like she could outrun anything. He paused. One morning she took a gelding too fast over rough ground, broke her neck on the East Ridge. Eleanor's hand found his without thinking. I'm sorry. I found her myself, still warm, eyes open, gone. His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened around hers. I was 28. That was 5 winters ago. Since then, I've ridden fences, mended gates, kept to myself. Not because I was afraid to love again, just didn't see the point. And now? He turned to look at her then, and his eyes held something that made her heart stutter. Now I think maybe the world wasn't done with me after all. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to let you in. I've built so many walls, I forgot where the door is. Clayton lifted her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her scarred knuckles. Then let me help you find it. I've got the rest of my life. We'll look together. She closed her eyes, leaning into him for the first time, and let herself believe that broken things could be reshaped into something stronger. That afternoon, Doc Harrison returned with Martha Kowalski. They stood in the clearing while snow dusted their shoulders and explained the territorial adoption law. It's simple, Doc said. If you two choose to form a family, and if witnesses from the community validate that choice, the child is legally recognized. No formal marriage required, though you're free to marry now if you want. Martha nodded, her face kind. 6 of us church ladies have already signed statements. We'll stand witness when the time comes. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Not pain, but relief so sharp it almost hurt. Why would you do this for me? Martha's eyes softened. Because I watched you build that cabin alone in the cold, girl. Watched you refuse charity, refuse pity, refuse to break. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that deserves defending. After they left, Eleanor and Clayton stood together in the falling snow. You don't have to do this, Eleanor said quietly. You could still walk away. Find someone without complications, without… Eleanor. Clayton turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. I don't want someone else. I want you. I want mornings building things together. I want to teach your son how to ride. I want to grow old knowing I chose something real over something easy. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. They worked until twilight, finishing the last of the roof beams. As Eleanor climbed down from the ladder, she paused, one hand braced against the cabin wall. What is it? Clayton was beside her instantly. Nothing. Just tired. But her face had gone pale. He studied her, then looked toward the horizon. The sky had taken on a strange yellow cast, and the air had gone too still. Storm's coming. A bad one. How can you tell? I've lived here all my life. That sky. He pointed. That's not just snow. That's a blizzard. As if in answer, the wind picked up, sudden and vicious. In the distance, Dark clouds roiled toward them like an advancing army. Eleanor's hand went to her belly. The baby had been restless all day, moving more than usual. How long do we have? Clayton scanned the sky, his face grim. Maybe an hour, maybe less. Then, on the western horizon, a thin column of smoke rose into the darkening air. Too thick for a chimney, too black for a cooking fire. Eleanor's breath stopped. That's coming from town. From your direction, Clayton finished. His face had gone pale. That's the Kowalski place. But as they watched, a second column appeared. Closer, much closer. Eleanor's voice came out as a whisper. That's my root cellar. That's my supplies. They ran. Clayton reached the root cellar first, but the damage was already done. The wooden door hung open, charred and smoking. Inside, flour sacks had been slashed, their contents scattered and ruined. Preserved vegetables lay smashed on the frozen ground. Someone had poured lamp oil over everything and set it alight. Not enough to burn the structure down, just enough to destroy 6 months of careful preparation. Eleanor stood at the entrance, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other cradling her belly. Everything she'd stored for winter, for the baby, gone. Who would do this? Her voice was barely audible. Clayton's jaw worked. I know exactly who. Hoofbeats announced visitors before they appeared. Marshal Ben Cotter rode into the clearing with 2 deputies flanking him. Behind them came Victoria Morrison in a covered carriage, and beside her rode Clayton's father, James Hartwell, a man who looked like his son, but with 30 more years of hardness carved into his features. The marshal dismounted, his face apologetic but his hand resting on his gun belt. Miss Sullivan, Mr. Hartwell, I'm afraid I need to have a word. About what? Clayton's voice was steel. There's been a complaint filed. The marshal pulled a document from his coat. Miss Morrison here claims Miss Sullivan has been trespassing on disputed territory. Says this homestead claim was never properly filed. That's a lie. Eleanor stepped forward, despite Clayton's restraining hand. I have the deed, registered in Willowbrook last June. Victoria spoke from the carriage, her voice carrying across the clearing with practiced precision. A deed signed by a woman who was, at the time, legally married, which means her husband's consent was required. Did you have that, Miss Sullivan? Eleanor's face went white. I didn't think so. Victoria's smile was thin, victorious. Which makes the purchase invalid. This land reverts to open territory, available for claim by anyone with proper documentation. That's not how territorial law works, Clayton began. It is when the judge reviewing the case happens to be Miss Morrison's uncle, the marshal interrupted quietly. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan, but until this gets sorted in Helena, you're going to need to vacate the property. Vacate? Eleanor's voice rose. This is my home. I built it with my own hands. Which makes you a squatter on disputed land. Victoria stepped down from the carriage, her boots crunching on snow. The law is quite clear. Clayton moved to stand beside Eleanor. She's 8 months pregnant. Where exactly do you expect her to go? That's not my concern, Victoria said coldly. Though I'm sure the charitable ladies of Willowbrook will find some accommodation. The church has a cellar, I believe. You can't do this. Eleanor's hands were shaking, her voice breaking. You burned my supplies. You destroyed everything I did no such thing. Victoria's eyes were ice. Though I understand root cellars can be dangerous in winter. Faulty oil lamps. Accidents happen. The marshal cleared his throat. Miss Sullivan, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your personal belongings. You have until sunrise tomorrow to clear the property. Ben, Clayton started. I'm sorry, Clayton. I truly am. But the law's the law, and I got my orders. The marshal's face was grim. Judge Morrison signed the eviction this morning. James Hartwell finally spoke, his voice like gravel. Son, you need to step away from this situation. Come home. We'll sort this out properly. No. Clayton's voice was flat. Don't be a fool. You've already thrown away your engagement, alienated half the county. Don't lose your inheritance over some woman you barely know. I know her. Clayton's hand found Eleanor's, held tight. I know she's worth more than all the land you own. His father's face darkened. You're making a mistake. Then it's mine to make. Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to something almost gentle, which made it more terrible. Clayton, be reasonable. She can't stay here. Winter's coming. She has no supplies, no shelter. The kindest thing you can do is let her go back east where she has family, where she belongs. I have no family, Eleanor said, her voice hollow. I have no one. All the more reason. She has me. Clayton's voice cut through the gathering dusk. And I'm not letting her go. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. You're choosing her over everything. Over your family, your name, your future. I'm choosing what's real over what's comfortable. The marshal shifted uncomfortably. Folks, the sun's setting. Miss Sullivan, I need your word you'll be gone by dawn. Eleanor looked at her half-built cabin, the walls she'd raised, the roof she'd framed, the chimney she'd mortared stone by stone. Her father's locket felt heavy at her throat. I want to see the eviction order, she said quietly. The marshal handed it over. Eleanor read it slowly, her lips moving, her eyes tracking each line. Then she looked up. This is dated 2 days ago, before Doc Harrison filed my freedom papers with the territorial office. Her voice strengthened. Which means this order is based on false information. I'm not married. Haven't been for 8 months. Which means my claim stands. Victoria's face went tight. That's not... She's right, the marshal said slowly, reading over Eleanor's shoulder. This order references her marital status as grounds for invalidation. If that status has changed... The law doesn't work that fast, Victoria snapped. Maybe not in Helena, Clayton said, but out here, a telegraph is enough. Doc Harrison sent those papers priority. They'll be filed by now. The marshal looked between them, then at the darkening sky. Snow had begun to fall again, harder now, the wind picking up. I'll need to verify with the territorial office, but that's going to take time, maybe a week or more. She doesn't have a week, Victoria said. She has until dawn. No. The marshal's voice was firm. She has until I get confirmation one way or another. That's how this works, Miss Morrison. I don't care whose uncle signed what. Victoria's face flushed with fury. She turned to James Hartwell. Are you going to let your son throw everything away for this? The older man studied Eleanor for a long moment, her proud stance, her scarred hands, the cabin rising behind her. Something shifted in his expression. That's his choice to make, he said finally, not mine. He turned his horse and rode away. Victoria stared after him, disbelief warring with rage on her face. Then she looked at Clayton one last time. You'll regret this. I already regret plenty, Clayton said quietly, but she won't be one of them. Victoria climbed back into her carriage and departed without another word, her driver snapping the reins harder than necessary. The marshal tipped his hat. I'll be back when I hear from Helena. Meanwhile, Miss Sullivan, I'd suggest you stay close to home. And Clayton, he paused, watch your back. This ain't over. After they left, Eleanor and Clayton stood in the clearing as full darkness descended and snow began to fall in earnest. I'm sorry, Eleanor whispered. You've lost everything because of me. Clayton pulled her close, wrapping his coat around both of them. I haven't lost anything that mattered. But as they stood there, the wind brought the distant sound of thunder, or something like it. Not thunder, Eleanor realized. The storm, the real one, and it was coming fast. The storm hit 3 days later, on a Thursday morning that dawned gray as old iron. Eleanor had spent those 3 days reinforcing the cabin, banking supplies, preparing for the worst. Clayton worked beside her from dawn to dusk, but each evening he had to ride back to Circle H. His father had made it clear. Help her if you must, but you sleep under this roof or you inherit nothing. On Wednesday night, Clayton had lingered at the cabin door, his hand on the frame, his eyes on Eleanor's face. I should stay, he'd said. You should go, she'd answered. I won't be the reason you lose your family. Eleanor. Go, Clayton. I'll be fine. But she wasn't fine. The baby had dropped lower, so low she could barely walk without pain. Her back ached constantly, and something felt wrong. A tension in her body, a tightness that came and went like distant thunder. Thursday morning, she woke to the sound of wind that didn't whisper. It screamed. Snow fell sideways, thick and blinding. The temperature had plummeted overnight. Eleanor's breath fogged inside the cabin despite the fire she'd kept burning. She looked out the window and saw nothing but white. By noon, the contractions started. At first, she told herself it was false labor. Too early. The baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks. But the pain came again, sharper this time, stealing her breath and doubling her over against the table. "No," she whispered. "Not now. Please, God, not now." But her body didn't listen to prayers. She tried to keep moving, tried to stay calm. She boiled water, laid out towels, gathered the baby clothes Mrs. Hartwell had sent. Her hands shook so badly she could barely grip the kettle. Another contraction hit, worse than before. She cried out, clutching the table, her vision blurring with pain. When it passed, she stumbled to the door and looked out. The storm had turned the world into a howling void. She couldn't see 20 feet. The drifts were already knee-high and building. No one was coming. No one could come. She was alone. Eleanor made her way back to the bed, a simple frame Clayton had built last week. She lay down, breathing hard, one hand on her enormous belly. "It's all right," she told the baby, told herself. "We can do this. Women have done this alone before. We'll be fine." But she didn't feel fine. She felt terrified. 10 miles north, Clayton stood at the window of Circle H Ranch House, watching the storm build into something monstrous. His father sat by the fire, reading. His brothers played cards at the table. Everything was warm, comfortable, safe. And Eleanor was alone. "I have to go," Clayton said. His father didn't look up. "You'll die in that storm." "Maybe, but she'll definitely die if I don't." James Hartwell set down his book. "Son, I know you think you love this woman, but love doesn't mean dying foolishly. Wait until morning. The storm will pass." "She's in labor." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. His father's head came up. "How do you know?" "I don't. But I know the baby dropped low 3 days ago. I know she's been having pains. I know this storm is exactly the kind of thing that would—" Clayton grabbed his coat. "I'm going." "Clayton, wait. I lost Sarah because I wasn't there when she needed me." Clayton's voice was raw. "I found her too late. Held her while she was still warm and couldn't do a damn thing to save her." He looked at his father. "I won't make that mistake twice. I'd rather die trying than live knowing I didn't." His father stood, something shifting in his weathered face. "Then take the bay. Clyde's the steadiest horse we've got." Clayton stared at him. "Don't look at me like that. I may be a hard man, but I'm not heartless." James moved to the door, opened it to the howling wind. "That woman built a cabin alone while carrying a child. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength this territory was built on." He paused. "If you're doing this, do it smart. Take blankets. Take the medical kit. And for God's sake, tie a rope around your waist so we can find your body if you go down." Clayton embraced his father, quick, hard, then ran for the barn. The storm swallowed him within minutes. Clyde was sure-footed and steady, but even the best horse couldn't see through a whiteout. Clayton, guided by instinct and desperate hope, trusting the gelding to feel the path beneath the drifts. 2 miles out, the wind hit them broadside. Clyde stumbled, recovered, pushed on. 4 miles out, Clayton lost feeling in his hands despite his gloves. 6 miles out, visibility dropped to nothing. He could barely see Clyde's ears. He leaned forward, spoke into the horse's mane. "Come on, boy. She needs us. Keep going." 7 miles out, the world tilted. Clyde's front leg punched through hidden ice. The gelding screamed, a sound Clayton had never heard a horse make, and went down hard, throwing Clayton sideways into a frozen creek bed. Ice shattered beneath him. Water, shockingly cold, closed over his head. He surfaced gasping, thrashing, blind with cold and terror. His shoulder had hit something hard. Pain lanced through his left side. He dragged himself onto the bank, shaking so violently his teeth chattered like stones in a cup. Clyde lay on the ice, breathing hard, trying to rise. His front leg was wrong, bent at an angle that made Clayton's stomach drop. No, no, please. Clayton crawled to the horse, ran his hands over the brake. Compound fracture. The gelding was done. Clyde looked at him with dark, knowing eyes. I'm sorry, Clayton whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. I'm so sorry, boy. He pulled his rifle from the saddle, hands shaking so badly he could barely work the action. He pressed the barrel to Clyde's head, behind the ear, and pulled the trigger. The shot was swallowed by the storm. Clayton took the saddlebags, blankets, medical kit, food, and left everything else. He had 3 miles left to walk, maybe 4, in a blizzard, with a possibly broken shoulder and no feeling in his extremities. He started walking. In the cabin, Eleanor screamed. The contractions were coming faster now, each one a wave of pain that left her breathless and weeping. She was alone in the dark. The fire had burned low, and she didn't have the strength to feed it. Please, she sobbed. Please, somebody. But there was no one, just her and the baby and the storm that wanted them both dead. She bore down, following instinct, following the relentless pressure that demanded action. Her body was doing this whether she was ready or not. Another contraction, another scream, and then, impossibly, a sound at the door. Not a knock, a thud, like something heavy falling against wood. Eleanor couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the pain. The door swung open, and Clayton Hartwell fell across the threshold. He was covered in ice. Blood stained his torn coat. His face was pale as death, his lips blue, but his eyes found hers across the cabin and held. Told you, he gasped. I'd come. Then he collapsed. Eleanor tried to reach him, but another contraction hit, and she fell back with a cry that tore from her throat like something dying. The baby was coming, and Clayton wasn't moving. Eleanor didn't know how she did it. Later, she would remember only fragments. The fire she somehow fed with one hand while bracing against contractions with the other. The way she crawled to Clayton and dragged blankets over him, her own body screaming in protest. The sound of her voice, hoarse, desperate, talking to him, begging him to stay alive, to stay with her. Don't you dare die, she sobbed between pains. Not after riding through hell to get here. Don't you dare. Clayton's eyes flickered open. Wasn't planning on it. His voice was barely a whisper, but it was there. He was there. Can you move? Eleanor asked. Give me a minute. He tried to sit up, gasped, fell back. His left shoulder hung wrong. Might have broken something. Your shoulder's dislocated. Eleanor had seen her father reset shoulders after shipyard accidents. I can fix it, but not. Another contraction stole her words, her breath, everything but white-hot pain. When it passed, Clayton had dragged himself closer to the fire. His color was returning, slowly. He pulled off his ice-caked coat with his good arm, his face gray with pain. How far apart? He asked. The contractions? Eleanor panted. 2 minutes. Maybe less. Then we don't have much time. He looked at her with eyes that had seen death and chosen life anyway. Tell me what to do. I need you to reset my shoulder first, then you help me. He gritted his teeth. I can't do much with one arm. Eleanor nodded, understanding. She crawled to him, her belly so low she could barely move. This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. Do it. She positioned herself behind him, placed her foot against his back for leverage, gripped his wrist. On 3. 1. She pulled on 2. Clayton's roar of pain mixed with the howling wind. The shoulder popped back into place with a sickening sound. He slumped forward, breathing hard, sweat beading on his face despite the cold. You lied, he gasped. My father taught me that too. Eleanor managed something between a laugh and a sob. Then another contraction hit, and she crumpled. Clayton was beside her instantly, his newly reset arm moving gingerly but functional. He helped her to the bed, his hands steady despite everything. I've birthed foals, he said. Calves. Even helped with a breech birth once on a neighbor's ranch. He looked at her. But I've never. Neither have I. Eleanor gripped his hand so hard her knuckles went white. We'll figure it out together. What followed was pain beyond anything Eleanor had imagined. Pain that made her scream until her voice broke. Pain that made her beg for it to stop, to end, to be over. But Clayton never left her side. He held her hand, spoke low and steady, told her she was strong, she was brave, she could do this. When she screamed that she couldn't, he said she already was. That's it, he murmured. You're doing it. Just like building that cabin, one nail at a time. You know how to push through hard things. Hours blurred together. The storm raged, the fire burned, and Eleanor pushed. I can see the head, Clayton said, his voice tight with something between awe and terror. Eleanor, one more. Give me one more. She bore down with everything she had left, all the strength she'd used to swing hammers, haul logs, survive abandonment in winter and a world that wanted her to disappear. And then, a cry. Small, indignant, alive. Eleanor sobbed once, just once, and reached for the tiny, squalling creature Clayton placed on her chest. The baby was red and wrinkled and perfect, his little fists waving, his eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world. A boy, Clayton said, his voice breaking. You have a son. Eleanor couldn't speak, could only hold this impossible, beautiful life and weep. Clayton worked quickly, his hands gentle as he tied and cut the cord, cleaned the baby with warm water, wrapped him in the yellow blanket Mrs. Hartwell had knitted. When it was done, he sank down beside the bed, his face exhausted and blood-stained and more alive than Eleanor had ever seen it. Hello, Thomas, Eleanor whispered to her son, kissing his damp head. That's your name, Thomas, after my father. She looked at Clayton, tears streaming. Thomas Clayton Sullivan. Clayton's breath caught. You're giving him my name? He should know who rode through a blizzard for him before he was even born. Eleanor's hand found his. Who kept his word when the whole world said to turn back? Clayton reached out with a trembling hand and touched the baby's tiny fingers. Thomas's fist closed around Clayton's thumb, holding tight. And Clayton, this man who hadn't wept when his wife died, who'd buried his grief so deep it had turned to stone, broke. He leaned his forehead against Eleanor's shoulder and cried like the world was ending and beginning all at once. Outside, the storm began to quiet. The wind dropped from a scream to a whisper, and through the cabin's small window, the faintest suggestion of light appeared on the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming. They had survived the night. Morning arrived quiet and gold. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin window and the weight of her son sleeping against her chest. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, only that she was warm and safe and not alone. Then she saw Clayton. He'd fallen asleep sitting on the floor beside the bed, his head tipped back against the wall, his hand still resting near hers. His clothes were stiff with dried blood and melted snow. His face was pale, exhausted, beautiful. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened. You're still here, Eleanor whispered. Where else would I be? His voice was rough with sleep and smoke. Before she could answer, the sound of horses outside made them both freeze. Clayton was on his feet instantly despite his injured shoulder, moving to the window. What he saw made his jaw tighten. It's Doc Harrison, and Martha Kowalski, and... He paused. Half the church congregation. Eleanor's heart dropped. Victoria? No, but the marshals with them. They came quietly, reverently, like visitors to a sacred place. Doc Harrison entered first, his medical bag in hand, his face breaking into a smile when he saw the baby. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed. You did it. Martha Kowalski pushed past him, tears already streaming down her weathered face. Oh, honey. Oh, you brave girl. She bent over Eleanor and Thomas, her hands gentle as she checked them both. He's perfect. Just perfect. More people crowded into the small cabin, women Eleanor barely knew, bringing food and blankets and soft words. Men stood awkwardly by the door, hats in hands, nodding respect. The marshal cleared his throat. Miss Sullivan, Mr. Hartwell. I received word from Helena this morning. Eleanor's arms tightened around Thomas. Your marriage to Charles Whitmore has been officially declared void. Bigamy charges are being filed against him in St. Louis. Marshal Cotter pulled papers from his coat. Which means your homestead claim stands. This land is yours, legal and clear. The cabin erupted in cheers and applause, but the marshal wasn't finished. There's more. He looked uncomfortable now. Miss Morrison and her father left town before dawn. Took the stage to Denver. Seems some of the bank's records went missing around the same time. Records showing Mr. Morrison had been taking loans against property he didn't own, including this homestead. Clayton's eyes narrowed. He tried to steal her land? Looks that way. Federal marshals are already on it. The marshal folded the papers. Point is, Miss Sullivan, you're in the clear, and Miss Morrison won't be troubling you anymore. Martha spoke up, her voice carrying over the murmurs. We've come to stand witness, if you'll have us. She looked at Clayton. For the adoption. If that's still what you want. Clayton looked at Eleanor. The question hung between them, unspoken but clear. Eleanor shifted Thomas in her arms, then held him out toward Clayton. Would you like to hold your son? The cabin went silent. Clayton's hands shook as he took the baby, cradling Thomas against his chest with the careful reverence of someone holding something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. Hello, son, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm Clayton. I'm going to be your father, if your mama will let me. On one condition, Eleanor said, and everyone held their breath. Clayton looked up, fear flashing across his face. Eleanor smiled, small, tired, real. You have to marry me properly, not because of laws or witnesses or what anyone else thinks, but because I love you, because you rode through hell when you could have stayed safe, because you saw me building alone and didn't try to fix me, you just picked up a hammer. Clayton's answering smile was sunrise after the longest night. Eleanor May Sullivan, nothing would make me prouder. Martha Kowalski pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed her eyes. Well, I suppose we can stand witness for a wedding too. Reverend Peters, you got your book? An elderly man Eleanor hadn't noticed stepped forward, grinning. I always carry it. Never know when love's going to break out. They married right there in the cabin Eleanor had built, with Thomas sleeping in Martha's arms and the congregation crowded into every corner. Clayton spoke his vows with Thomas's tiny handprint still visible on his shirt. Eleanor spoke hers with sawdust in her hair and her father's locket warm against her heart. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Clayton kissed her gently, carefully, like she might break, and whispered against her lips, "Thank you for letting me find the door." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "Thank you for helping me build it." Spring came 6 weeks later, slow and cautious, melting the snow one stubborn inch at a time. Eleanor stood on the finished porch, roof complete, door hung, windows glazed, watching Clayton teach Thomas how to grip a finger. The baby was too young to understand, but Clayton spoke to him anyway, his voice soft and serious, explaining about horses and timber and the way mountains looked at dawn. The door behind her bore a new handle, a horseshoe Clayton had found bent and useless in the snow, then heated and reshaped until it fit perfectly. Found it broken, he'd said while installing it. Thought it was scrap. Turns out it just needed purpose. Eleanor had traced the worn metal with her fingers. Like some people. Like us. Now she watched her husband and son in the morning light and felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Belonging. The sound of approaching horses made her look up. James Hartwell rode into the clearing, followed by Clayton's brothers. They'd kept their distance since the wedding, unsure of their welcome. Clayton stood, Thomas in his arms, and waited. His father dismounted slowly, his weathered face uncertain. "Son, I came to—" He stopped, seeing Thomas for the first time. Something in his expression crumbled. "May I?" Clayton placed his son in his father's arms. James Hartwell looked down at the baby, and his voice when he spoke was thick with emotion. "He has Sarah's eyes. My Sarah. Your mother." He touched Thomas's tiny hand. "I was wrong, about a lot of things, but mostly about her." He nodded toward Eleanor. "She's got more backbone than half the men in the territory, including me. I know, Clayton said simply. I'd like to be part of this, if you'll let me. James looked between them. Be a grandfather. Help with the ranch when you're ready. Make amends. Eleanor stepped forward and took the old man's hand. Family isn't just blood, Mr. Hartwell. It's who shows up, who stays, who tries. She smiled. You're trying, that's enough. That afternoon, they planted a garden. Eleanor and Clayton, James and his sons, Martha and Doc Harrison, and half the church ladies. They turned the earth where Eleanor's root cellar had burned, and from ash and ruin, they sowed seeds for summer. As the sun set gold over the mountains, Eleanor sat on her porch with Thomas at her breast and Clayton's arm around her shoulders. The horseshoe door handle gleamed in the fading light. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, and in the distance, the last patches of snow surrendered to spring. What are you thinking? Clayton asked. Eleanor looked at the cabin she'd built, the family she'd found, the life she'd fought for and won. I'm thinking broken things can carry weight if they're shaped right. I'm thinking winter doesn't last forever. I'm thinking... She turned to kiss him. I'm thinking we're home. Thomas made a small sound, something between a sigh and a coo, and both of them laughed. The stars came out one by one, like witnesses gathering to watch this small, impossible miracle. A family forged in blizzards and blood and stubborn, relentless hope. And in the morning, there would be breakfast to make, and logs to split, and a son to raise, and 1,000 ordinary miracles to tend. But tonight, they simply sat together in the quiet, 3 hearts beating in rhythm, and let the peace of it settle into their bones like spring settling into frozen earth. Some things once built stand forever. Now I've lived through 68 winters in Montana, and I can tell you this for certain. The weather don't care about your plans. Neither does love. Both'll come when they're good and ready, and all you can do is make sure you've got a roof and a fire when they arrive. Eleanor Hartwell, I should say, she understood that better than most. She knew you can't wait for perfect conditions to start building your life. You just pick up the hammer and begin, even when your hands are shaking, even when the snow's already falling, even when every sensible person says you're a fool for trying. I reckon that's the difference between surviving and living. Surviving is waiting for things to get easier. Living is driving nails in November with a baby in your belly and winter breathing down your neck. That cabin's still standing today, 140 years later. I've seen it myself, out past the old Kowalski place, where the aspens grow thick and the creek runs clear in summer. The horseshoe's still on the door, worn smooth by 5 generations of hands opening it to come home. Some folks say you can still feel warmth coming from inside, even when nobody's living there. Like love, once kindled right, never quite goes cold. Like the stones remember what it meant to shelter people who refuse to give up on each other. I believe it. I've stood on that porch on winter mornings and felt something I can't quite name. Something that feels like hope, mixed with stubbornness, mixed with the kind of faith that says, I'm going to keep swinging this hammer even if it kills me, because what I'm building matters more than my comfort. Thomas Clayton Hartwell grew up to be a fine man, raised 3 daughters of his own in that same cabin his mama built, taught them carpentry, same as his grandfather taught Eleanor back in Boston, taught them to shoe horses, mend fences, and more important, taught them that family is something you choose and then fight for, not something that just happens because of blood. One of those daughters was my grandmother, Eliza. Which means I'm telling you a story about my own people, about the night I almost wasn't born because winter wanted my great-grandmother dead, and a widower cowboy named Clayton Hartwell said, "Not today, you don't." See, Grandma Eliza used to sit me on that same porch when I was a boy and tell me about the blizzard, about how her father, Thomas, was born in the worst storm anyone could remember, and how his daddy walked 7 miles through hell itself after his horse died just to be there. She'd point to the horseshoe on the door and say, there's a reminder, Silas. Broken things can still carry weight. They just need someone willing to reshape them." I didn't understand what she meant when I was 7, but I understand now. The thing about hard winters, and I mean the real ones, not just the weather, but the seasons of life that try to break you, is they don't just take Sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and brave enough and you refuse to face them alone, they give back double what they took. They show you who's worth keeping and who's just passing through. They burn away everything that's not essential and leave you with what matters. The people who show up, who stay, who ride through storms when any sane person would hunker down and wait for better weather. Clayton could have stayed home that night. His father told him to. Common sense told him to. Survival instinct told him to. But love, real love, the kind that builds things instead of just talking about them, love told him to saddle that horse and ride. And Clyde, that 20-year-old bay gelding, he carried Clayton 7 miles before his legs gave out. Carried him far enough that Clayton could walk the rest. Sometimes that's all love can do, carry you as far as possible, and then trust you'll carry yourself the last miles on sheer determination. Maybe that's what family is when you strip away all the pretty words and the fancy definitions. It's people carrying each other, taking turns when one gets tired, reshaping each other's broken pieces into something useful, building something together that neither could build alone. Eleanor and Clayton, they built more than a cabin that winter. They built a template, a way of being in the world that said, dignity matters more than comfort. Chosen family is as real as blood family, and love, real love, is measured in hammer swings and frozen miles walked and doors held open even when the wind wants to slam them shut. Now, I know some of you listening have seen your own hard winters. Maybe you're in one right now. Maybe you're building something alone and wondering if you've got the strength to finish it. Maybe you're the one riding through the storm, or maybe you're the one waiting by the fire, praying someone cares enough to come. Either way, I want you to know something. That horseshoe's still on the door. The cabin's still standing. The story's still being told. Because what's built right, with honest hands and stubborn hearts and the willingness to choose love over comfort, that doesn't fall. Not in one winter, not in 100. Thomas used to say his mama taught him that dignity ain't something you're born with or given by others. It's something you claim for yourself, one choice at a time, one nail driven, one truth spoken, one promise kept when breaking it would have been easier. And Clayton? He taught Thomas that being a man isn't about strength or pride or never needing help. It's about showing up. Especially when showing up might cost you everything. I reckon that's a lesson worth remembering. So if this story touched you, if you saw yourself in Eleanor's determination or Clayton's devotion, if you've ever built something alone or ridden through a storm for someone you love, if you've ever been the broken thing that got reshaped into something useful, I'd like to know where you're listening from. I like knowing my grandmother's story is traveling to places she never got to see, touching hearts in towns she never got to visit. Leave a comment below. Tell me your own story if you're willing. Because that's how we keep these things alive, not by preserving them in amber, but by living them again and again, in new places, with new people, building new cabins against new winters. Till next time, friends, may your winters be short, your springs be sweet, and may you always have the courage to build something worth keeping, even when the snow's already falling, even when you're scared, even when you're alone. Because here's the truth Eleanor and Clayton proved that night in 1882, and it's still true today. You're only alone until you decide not to be. You're only broken until you decide broken things can carry weight. You're only lost until you pick a direction and start walking, even if you can't see more than 2 feet ahead. And that, friends, that stubborn, foolish, beautiful decision to keep building, keep walking, keep loving, even when the whole world says to quit, that makes all the difference. May your dignity carry you through.